Robert Williams had been walking this same route for 37 years. Every morning at exactly 7:15, the 68-year-old man would step out of his small brick house on Elm Street and begin his daily walk through downtown Millbrook. It wasn't just exercise for him. It was his way of staying connected to the community he'd served as a postal worker for 4 decades before retiring. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as Robert made his way past the old hardware store and the coffee shop where Mrs. Patterson always waved from behind the counter. His khaki pants were pressed, his polo shirt tucked in neatly, and his gray hair combed back just like it had been every day since he was 20. Some folks in the neighborhood called him Mr. Reliable because you could set your watch by his daily routine. Robert loved these quiet morning moments. The streets were peaceful, with only a few early commuters heading to work. He'd nod to the joggers, smile at dog walkers, and sometimes stop to chat with shop owners preparing for the day ahead. This wasn't just his neighborhood anymore. After almost 4 decades of delivering mail to these houses, he knew every family, every story, every celebration and heartbreak that happened behind these doors, but this Tuesday morning felt different. Somehow, as Robert turned onto Main Street, he noticed a police car parked outside Johnson's Bakery. The engine was running, and through the windshield he could see the officer inside talking on his radio. Robert didn't think much of it at first. Police officers bought coffee from Johnson's all the time. What Robert didn't know was that Officer Derek Hoffman had been having a rough few weeks. His sergeant had been asking questions about some recent complaints, and the pressure was getting to him. Hoffman was the kind of cop who saw problems everywhere, especially in places where he felt they didn't belong. And right now, watching this older black man walking slowly down Main Street, something inside Hoffman's mind started clicking the wrong way. Robert was just passing the bakery when he heard a car door slam behind him. He turned around to see the police officer walking toward him with quick, purposeful steps. The officer's hand was resting on his belt, and his face had that look Robert had seen before. It was a look that made his stomach tighten, even though he knew he hadn't done anything wrong. "Excuse me," Officer Hoffman called out, his voice carrying more authority than the situation seemed to require. "I need to talk to you." Robert stopped, walking, and turned around completely, keeping his hands visible just like his son had taught him during one of their conversations about staying safe. "Good morning, officer. How can I help you?" Hoffman approached closer, studying Robert's face, like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "What are you doing in this area?" The question hit Robert like a cold splash of water. He'd been walking these streets since before this officer was probably even born. "I live here, sir. Just taking my morning walk like I do every day." "You live here?" Hoffman's tone suggested he didn't believe it. "Where exactly?" Robert pointed back toward Elm Street. 2 blocks that way, the brick house with the blue shutters. "Been there since 1987? He kept his voice calm and respectful even, though anger was starting to build in his chest. This was his neighborhood. He'd helped build this community, delivered mail to half these houses, watched kids grow up and start families of their own. Officer Hoffman looked Robert up and down, as if trying to find something wrong with his appearance. "You got some ID on you?" "Of course." Robert slowly reached for his wallet, moving deliberately so there would be no misunderstanding about his actions. He pulled out his driver's license and handed it over. The address clearly showed Elm Street. Right here in Millbrook. Hoffman examined the license for much longer than necessary, holding it up to the light like he suspected it might be fake. Other pedestrians were starting to notice the interaction. Now, Mrs. Chun from the flower shop had stepped outside and was watching with concern. A young mother pushing a stroller had slowed down, clearly uncomfortable with what she was seeing. "This address current?" Hoffman asked, finally handing the license back. "Yes, sir. Been current for 38 years now." Robert's voice was steady, but inside he was fighting a familiar battle. The same battle his father had fought, and his grandfather before him. The battle of having to prove you belonged in your own neighborhood. Something in Robert's tone seemed to irritate Hoffman even more. Maybe it was the quiet dignity or the way Robert refused to be intimidated. "You sure you're not looking for trouble around here?" Maybe checking out houses, seeing what you can get into. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Robert felt his heart rate increase, but he kept his expression neutral. Officer, I've been a resident of this community for almost 40 years. I was a postal worker. I delivered mail to most of these houses. I'm not looking for any trouble. I'm just taking my morning walk. By now, several people had stopped to watch the interaction. Some were pulling out their phones. In today's world, everyone knew that recording these situations was important. The bakery owner, Mr. Johnson, had come outside and was standing in his doorway with his arms crossed. Clearly unhappy with what was happening in front of his business, Officer Hoffman noticed the growing audience and seemed to feel like he needed to escalate the situation to maintain control. I'm going to need you to put your hands behind your back. What? Robert couldn't hide his shock. Why? What did I do wrong? You're being detained for suspicious behavior and failure to comply with a police investigation. But I did comply. I showed you my ID. I answered all your questions. Robert's voice was getting higher now, and he could feel the panic starting to set in. He'd done everything right, everything his son had told him to do in situations like this. Put your hands behind your back now, or you'll be charged with resisting arrest too. Robert looked around at the faces watching him. Some looked angry, others scared. He saw Mrs. Patterson from the coffee shop covering her mouth with her hand. He saw teenagers recording with their phones. He saw his neighbors, people who had known him for decades, watching him be treated like a criminal on the street where he'd lived peacefully for nearly 40 years. With no choice left, Robert slowly put his hands behind his back. Officer, please, I haven't done anything wrong. This is my neighborhood. These people know me. But Hoffman wasn't listening anymore. As he moved to put the handcuffs on Robert, the older man shifted slightly to maintain his balance. It was barely noticeable, just a small step to steady himself. But Hoffman interpreted it as resistance. Stop resisting! Hoffman shouted and suddenly shoved Robert hard in the chest. Robert stumbled backward, his arms windmilling as he tried to catch his balance. But at 68, with arthritis in his knees and a hip that had been bothering him for months, he couldn't recover. He fell hard onto the concrete sidewalk, his right wrist taking the brunt of the impact as he tried to break his fall. The sound of Robert hitting the pavement seemed to echo through the street. Several people gasped. Someone screamed. And the phones that had been recording everything captured every single second of a peaceful morning walk, turning into something that would change not just Robert's life, but the entire community of Millbrook forever. The emergency room at Millbrook General Hospital had seen its share of difficult cases, but the 68-year-old man lying on bed 7 had the entire staff talking. Not because of his injuries, though the fractured wrist and bruised ribs were certainly painful. It was the way he'd gotten hurt that had everyone upset. Robert Williams sat on the edge of the hospital bed, his right arm now in a cast from his fingertips to just below his elbow. Every breath sent a sharp pain through his ribs, and the bruises on his back were already turning dark purple. But the physical pain wasn't what bothered him most. It was the look in his wife Gloria's eyes when she'd rushed into the emergency. Room an hour earlier, Gloria had been married to Robert for 43 years. She'd seen him through a heart attack 5 years ago, watched him recover from knee surgery, and helped him through the death of his parents, but she'd never seen him look so defeated. Her husband, the man who'd always stood tall and proud, seemed smaller somehow, like something inside him had been broken along with his wrist. The doctor says you can go home in a few hours, Gloria said softly, adjusting the blanket around his shoulders. Your x-rays look good, nothing that won't heal. Robert nodded, but his mind was somewhere else. He kept replaying the moment on the sidewalk, wondering what he could have done differently. Maybe if he'd kept his mouth shut. Maybe if he'd just answered the questions and walked away. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't have mattered. Officer Hoffman had made up his mind about Robert before they'd even spoken. The curtain around the bed suddenly swept open, and their daughter Lisa rushed in with tears streaming down her face. She'd gotten the call at work and driven straight to the hospital, still wearing her nurse's scrubs from the pediatric ward where she worked. Dad, oh my God, are you okay? Lisa grabbed his good hand and squeezed it tight. Mrs. Chun called me. She saw the whole thing. She said that he just pushed you down for no reason. I'm fine, sweetheart, Robert said, though. His voice didn't sound convincing, just a little banged up. But Lisa wasn't buying it. She'd inherited her father's stubbornness and her mother's fierce protective instincts. This is not fine, Dad. What happened out there was wrong. Completely wrong. Before Robert could respond, Lisa's phone started buzzing. She looked at the screen and her face grew serious. It's Tony. He's been trying to reach you for the past hour. Tony was Robert's son, though most people knew him by his military rank rather than his first name. Lieutenant Commander Anthony Williams was somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean on a Navy ship, but somehow word had already reached him about what happened to his father. Gloria took the phone. Tony? Yes, he's okay. Well, he's hurt, but he's going to be fine. She paused, listening to her son's voice coming through the phone. Even from across the room, Robert could hear the concern and anger in Tony's tone. No, don't do anything crazy, Gloria continued. Your father needs you to stay calm right now. We all do. Another pause. Yes, people recorded it. It's already on the news. The news. Robert hadn't even thought about that. In today's world, everything ended up on the internet within hours. The idea of strangers watching him get knocked down on his own street made his stomach turn. Dr. Peterson, the emergency room physician, knocked on the doorframe before entering. He was a young man, probably in his early 30s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Mr. Williams, I have your discharge papers ready. But before you go, I want to talk to you about something. Robert looked up expectantly. I've been working in emergency rooms for 8 years now, Dr. Peterson said, pulling up a chair. I've seen a lot of injuries from a lot of different situations. What happened to you today, that's not normal police procedure. The way you hit that concrete, you're lucky you didn't break your hip or crack your skull. Lisa squeezed her father's hand tighter. Doctor, is there anything we need to do? Any tests or follow-up? Medically, he'll be fine with rest and physical therapy for the wrist. But I've also documented everything very carefully in his medical records. The photos, the x-rays, my observations about how these injuries occurred. If you decide to pursue this legally, you'll have complete medical documentation. The word legally hung in the air. Robert had never sued anyone in his life. He'd always believed in working things out, talking through problems, finding peaceful solutions. But this felt different. This wasn't just about him anymore, Gloria's. Phone rang again. This time it was their neighbor, Mrs. Patterson from the coffee shop. She wanted to make sure Robert was okay and to tell them that at least 6 people had recorded the incident on their phones. The local news station had already called her for an interview. This is getting bigger than just us, Gloria said after hanging up. Channel 7 wants to do a story. The mayor's office called asking for details. And someone from the NAACP is driving up from the state office. Robert closed his eyes and leaned back against the pillow. All he'd wanted was to take his morning walk. Now his life was becoming a news story. His private pain turned into a public spectacle. Part of him just wanted to go home, ice his ribs, and pretend none of this had ever happened. But then he thought about Officer Hoffman. He thought about the look in that man's eyes, the way he'd treated Robert like he didn't belong in his own neighborhood. And he thought about other people, other fathers and grandfathers who might have to walk down that same street and face that same officer. Lisa's phone buzzed with a text message. She read it and her expression changed. Dad, you need to see this. She showed him the screen. It was a message from her cousin David, who worked at the police station in the next town over. Tell Uncle Robert that Hoffman has a history. This isn't the first time. People have been complaining about him for years, but nothing ever happens. Maybe now it will. The room fell silent. Robert stared at the phone screen, processing what this meant. If Officer Hoffman had done this before, if there were other victims, then staying quiet wasn't just about protecting himself anymore. It was about protecting everyone else who might cross paths with that officer. Dr. Peterson stood up and handed Robert a card. This is the contact information for a victim's advocate. She helps people navigate situations like this. You don't have to decide anything right now, but if you want to talk to someone who understands the system, she's very good. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Robert's mind was spinning. The parking lot outside was filled with news vans. Reporters were already setting up cameras, waiting for a statement or a comment. The story of his morning walk had become something much bigger than he'd ever imagined. Gloria helped him into their car through a side exit, avoiding the media crowd. As they drove home, Robert looked out the window at the familiar streets of Millbrook. This was still his neighborhood, still his home. But something fundamental had changed. The question now was what he was going to do about it. His phone buzzed with another call. This time it was Tony calling back, and Robert knew his son wasn't going to give up until they had a real conversation about what happened and what came next. 3,000 miles away from Millbrook, Lieutenant Commander Anthony Williams stood on the deck of a Navy destroyer cutting through the dark waters of the Atlantic. The satellite phone in his hand felt heavier than any weapon he'd ever carried. He'd just finished his third conversation with his family in 2 hours, and the rage burning in his chest was unlike anything he'd experienced in 15 years of military service. Tony had seen combat in places most people couldn't pronounce. He'd led missions behind enemy lines, made split-second decisions that saved lives, and earned medals that sat quietly in a drawer back home. But nothing in his military training had prepared him for the helpless fury of hearing that someone had hurt his father while he was thousands of miles away. Unable to do anything about it, the video had reached him through unofficial channels. Someone in his unit had seen it on social media and quietly sent him the link. Watching his 68-year-old father get shoved to the ground by a police officer had been like taking a punch to the gut. Tony had watched it 17 times now, each viewing making him angrier and more determined to do something about it. But what exactly could he do? That was the question that had been eating at him for the past 6 hours. Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez found Tony on the deck, staring out at the ocean. Rodriguez was Tony's closest friend on the ship, a guy who'd served alongside him for 8 years and knew him better than most family members. "Heard about your pops," Rodriguez said quietly. "That's some serious stuff, man." Tony nodded but didn't turn around. "He's a good man, Rodriguez. Best man I know. 68 years old, never hurt anybody in his life. Delivered mail for 40 years. Helped half the neighborhood with their problems. And this is how he gets treated on his own street. What are you thinking about doing?" That was the million-dollar question. Tony's first instinct had been pure. Soldier. He wanted to request emergency leave, fly home, and have a very direct conversation with Officer Hoffman. The kind of conversation that would leave no doubt about what happened to people who hurt his family. But Tony wasn't just any soldier. He was part of an elite unit that operated in the shadows. And he knew that kind of thinking would destroy everything he'd worked for. "I keep going back and forth," Tony admitted. "Part of me wants to handle this the way we handle problems overseas. Quick, direct, permanent solution." Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. "But that's not who you are, Williams? And it's not what your father would want?" Tony knew his friend was right. His father had raised him to be better than that. Robert Williams had taught his son that real strength wasn't about overpowering your enemies. It was about outsmarting them, outworking them, and finding ways to win that left you able to look at yourself in the mirror afterward. "You know what the crazy part is?" Tony said, finally turning to face Rodriguez. "I've spent my whole career fighting for justice and freedom in other countries. I've risked my life protecting people I've never met. But when it comes to protecting my own father in his own neighborhood, I feel completely powerless." Rodriguez leaned against the ship's railing. "Maybe that's because you're thinking about this the wrong way. You're not powerless, man. You've, got skills most people don't have. You know how to gather intelligence, how to build cases, how to coordinate operations. Maybe this isn't about muscle. Maybe it's about using your brain." The comment hit Tony like a lightning bolt. He'd been so focused on his anger that he hadn't been thinking strategically. But Rodriguez was right. Tony had spent years learning how to analyze complex situations, identify weaknesses in enemy systems, and develop comprehensive plans to achieve objectives. Why couldn't he apply those same skills to this situation? Tony's phone buzzed with another text from his sister Lisa. She'd been sending him updates throughout the day. The local news had run the story. The mayor had issued a statement promising a thorough investigation. The police chief had called it an isolated incident and said Officer Hoffman was on administrative leave, pending review, but Lisa had also sent him something else. Screenshots of social media posts from other people in Millbrook, people talking about their own encounters with Officer Hoffman. Stories about traffic stops that lasted too long, searches that seemed unnecessary, and a pattern of behavior that targeted certain members of the community. Tony studied the information his sister had sent him. This wasn't just about his father anymore. This was about a system that had allowed one officer to operate unchecked for years. And suddenly, Tony realized what his real mission was. He called his father back. Robert answered on the second ring, sounding tired but alert. "Dad, I've been thinking about what happened today, and I need to ask you something important." "What's that, son?" "How many other people do you think Officer Hoffman has done this to? People who maybe didn't have family to stand up for them, or couldn't afford lawyers, or were too scared to speak out." Robert was quiet for a long moment. "Probably more than we know about. That's what I thought. So here's what I want to do. I want to find them, all of them. I want to document everything that officer has ever done wrong, and I want to build a case so strong that he never has the chance to hurt anyone else again." "Tony, that sounds like a big job. And you're stuck on that ship." "Not for long. I've got some leave time saved up, and I think this qualifies as a family emergency. But more than that, I've got resources and skills that most people don't have. I know how to investigate, how to gather evidence, how to put together the kind of comprehensive report that makes people pay attention." Tony could hear his father's breathing change, could sense the shift in his mood. "You really think we can make a difference?" "Dad, I've spent my career taking down bad guys in places where the odds were stacked against us. This time, we've got the law on our side, we've got evidence, and we've got a community that's ready to stand up. Officer Hoffman picked the wrong family to mess with." After ending the call with his father, Tony spent the next 2 hours on his laptop. He started researching everything he could find about police misconduct cases, successful civil rights lawsuits, and the legal processes for filing complaints against law enforcement officers. He reached out to contacts he'd made over the years, people who worked in different government agencies and might have access to information or resources. By midnight, Tony had filled 20 pages with notes and had developed the outline of a plan. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice. It was about making sure that what happened to his father never happened to anyone else's father. Commander Patterson found Tony in the ship's communications center at 2 in the morning, still working on his laptop. Patterson was Tony's direct superior, a tough woman who'd earned her rank through 30 years of outstanding service. "Williams, I heard about your family situation. How are you holding up?" Tony looked up from the screen. "I'm doing better now that I have a plan, ma'am. Want to talk about it?" Tony explained his idea to use his skills and resources to build a comprehensive case against Officer Hoffman. Commander Patterson listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious as Tony laid out his strategy. "That's ambitious," she said when he finished. "And it's going to take time and energy. Are you sure you want to take this on?" "Ma'am, my father taught me that you stand up for what's right even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. This officer has been getting away with hurting people for years because nobody had the resources or knowledge to stop him. Well, now he's messed with someone who does." Commander Patterson nodded slowly. "I'll approve your emergency leave request. And Williams? If you need any help with research or documentation, you let me know. What happened to your father was wrong, and if there are other victims out there, they deserve justice too." As Tony finally headed back to his quarters, he felt something he hadn't felt since watching that video of his father hitting the pavement. He felt hope. And more than that, he felt like he finally had a mission worthy of everything the Navy had taught him. Tony Williams stepped off the plane at Springfield Regional Airport exactly 72 hours after watching the video of his father's assault. He'd managed to secure emergency leave and catch a military transport that got him stateside faster than any commercial flight could have. His duffel bag contained more than just clothes. Hidden in a secure compartment were folders full of research he'd compiled during the journey home, along with contact information for people who might be able to help with what he was planning. Robert was waiting for him at the airport, his right arm still in a cast and moving more slowly than usual. But when father and son embraced, Tony could feel some of the strength returning to the older man's posture. Having family close during a crisis made all the difference in the world. "How are you really doing, Dad?" Tony asked as they walked toward the parking garage. "Better now that you're here," Robert replied. "But I'll be honest with you, son. This whole thing has shaken me up more than I want to admit. I keep thinking about what could have happened if I'd hit my head instead of my wrist. What if I hadn't gotten back up?" Tony felt that familiar anger rising in his chest, but he pushed it down. Anger wasn't going to help them now. Clear thinking and careful planning would. During the drive home, Robert filled Tony in on everything that had happened since their last phone call. The local news had run follow-up stories. The police department had issued a statement saying they were conducting an internal investigation. Mayor Thompson had promised to look into the matter personally, but nobody seemed to be talking about any real consequences for Officer Hoffman. "What about the other victims?" Tony asked. "Has anyone else come forward?" Robert nodded grimly. 3 people so far. Mrs. Chun from the flower shop says her nephew got roughed up by the same officer last year during a traffic stop. And there's a young man named Jerome whose mother called your sister. Apparently, Hoffman arrested him for disorderly conduct when he was just sitting on his own front porch. Tony pulled out a notebook and started writing down names. This was exactly what he'd hoped to find, though it made him sick to think about. How many people had suffered in silence? The next morning, Tony began what he privately called Operation Justice. His first stop was the Millbrook Public Library, where he'd arranged to meet with Catherine Rodriguez, a civil rights attorney who'd driven up from the state capitol after hearing about Robert's case. Tony had found her through his research and been impressed by her track record of taking on police misconduct cases. Catherine was a small woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. She'd reviewed the video footage and medical records that Tony had sent her, and she was as angry as Tony had ever seen a lawyer get. "Your father's case is textbook excessive force," she said, spreading files across the library table. "But what makes this really interesting is the pattern you've started to identify. If we can document multiple incidents with the same officer, we're not just talking about one bad day. We're talking about systemic abuse." Tony leaned forward. "What do we need to prove that? Official complaints, witness statements, medical records if people sought treatment, and any video evidence we can find. The challenge is that many victims of police misconduct never file formal complaints because they don't trust the system to protect them. That's where Tony's military training came in handy. He'd spent years learning how to gather intelligence from reluctant sources, how to build trust with people who had every reason to be suspicious of authority figures. Over the next week, he methodically worked through the community, talking to people who'd had negative encounters with Officer Hoffman. The stories he collected were heartbreaking. There was Mr. Washington, a 75-year-old veteran who'd been pulled over 6 times in 2 years for driving suspiciously in his own neighborhood. There was Jennifer Martinez, a single mother who'd been arrested for interfering with police business when she asked why officers were searching her teenage son's backpack at a bus stop. There was David Kim, a college student home for winter break who'd been handcuffed and held for 2 hours because Hoffman claimed he matched the description of someone they were looking for. Each person Tony spoke with had the same story. They'd considered filing complaints, but the process seemed designed to discourage them. The paperwork was complicated. They had to file it at the same police station where Hoffman worked, and previous complainants had told them nothing ever came of it anyway. Tony documented everything with military precision. He took detailed notes, collected contact information, and photographed any evidence people were willing to share. He also discovered something that made his blood boil. Officer Hoffman had been promoted twice in the past 5 years, despite the fact that informal complaints about his behavior were common knowledge in certain parts of the community. The breakthrough came when Tony visited Jerome Patterson, the young man who'd been arrested on his own front porch. Jerome was initially reluctant to talk, but when Tony showed up in civilian clothes and explained that his own father had been victimized by the same officer, the young man's attitude changed. "Man, I tried to file a complaint about that cop," Jerome said. "But when I went to the station, they made me wait for 3 hours, then told me the complaint forms were temporarily unavailable when I came back the next day. The desk sergeant asked me if I was sure I wanted to make trouble for a decorated officer over a misunderstanding." Jerome pulled out his phone and showed Tony something that made the Navy SEAL's eyes widen. "I recorded the whole thing on my porch that day. The arrest, everything, but I was too scared to do anything with it." The video was even more damning than the footage of Robert's assault. It showed Hoffman approaching Jerome, who was clearly sitting peacefully on his own property and escalating the situation until he had an excuse to make an arrest. What made it worse was that you could hear Hoffman using language that was clearly intended to provoke a reaction. "Jerome, this video could change everything," Tony said. "But I need to ask you something important. Are you willing to go public with this? Because once we start this process, there's no going back." Jerome looked at Tony for a long moment. "Your dad seems like a good man. He didn't deserve what happened to him. And honestly, I'm tired of being scared to sit on my own porch. Yeah, I'll go public, but I want to make sure we do this right." That evening, Tony called Catherine Rodriguez with an update. He now had documented evidence of abuse from 7 different victims, including 2 videos and multiple witness statements. More importantly, he discovered that several people had attempted to file formal complaints but had been discouraged or blocked by the department's internal processes. "This is exactly what we needed," Catherine said. "We're not just dealing with one rogue officer anymore. We're dealing with a department that's actively covering up misconduct. That opens up federal civil rights violations, and it means we can involve agencies outside the local police department." Tony's next call was to Commander Patterson on his ship. He gave her a detailed briefing on what he'd discovered and asked for guidance on involving federal authorities. "Williams, what you've uncovered sounds like a pattern of civil rights violations," Patterson said. "I'm going to connect you with someone at the FBI's Civil Rights Division. They handle cases like this, and they have the authority to investigate entire police departments, not just individual officers." As Tony hung up the phone, he felt like he was finally getting somewhere, but he also knew that the real work was just beginning. Taking down a corrupt system was a lot harder than taking down individual bad guys. It required patience, strategy, and the kind of sustained effort that could take months or even years to pay off. But looking at his father, who was slowly regaining his confidence and sense of dignity as the investigation progressed, Tony knew it would be worth every minute of effort. Officer Hoffman had picked the wrong family to mess with, and now he was about to learn what happened when you went up against someone who knew how to fight back the right way. 2 weeks after coming home, Tony Williams stood in the Millbrook Community Center facing a room packed with over 300 people. He'd never spoken to a crowd this large before, but his military training had taught him to stay calm under pressure. What surprised him wasn't the size of the crowd, but the diversity of it. Black families sat next to white families. Elderly veterans shared rows with college students. Business owners talked quietly with factory workers. Officer Hoffman's actions had brought together people who normally never crossed paths. Tony had spent the morning going over his notes one final time. Tonight wasn't just about his father's case anymore. It was about something much bigger. Over the past 2 weeks, his investigation had uncovered a pattern of abuse that went back almost 8 years. 15 different victims had come forward, and Tony suspected there were many more who hadn't found the courage to speak up yet. The community meeting had been Catherine Rodriguez's idea. If we're going to challenge an entire system, she'd told Tony, we need the community behind us. People need to understand that this isn't just about one family's problem. It's about everyone's safety. Robert Williams sat in the front row. His cast now replaced with a brace, but his posture straighter than it had been since the assault. Next to him sat Jerome Patterson, the young man whose porch arrest video had become crucial evidence. Behind them were other victims, some who'd agreed to go public and others who were still deciding whether they felt safe enough to speak out. Tony began by telling his father's story, but he kept it simple and focused on the facts. He showed the video footage that had started everything, but he didn't dwell on the violence. Instead, he talked about what happened afterward. How the police department had initially tried to dismiss the incident. How Officer Hoffman had remained on duty even after video evidence proved he'd used excessive force. How the internal investigation seemed designed to protect the officer rather than seek the truth. My father is a good man who deserved better, Tony said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. But as I started digging into this case, I realized something important. This wasn't just about my dad. This was about a pattern of behavior that had been going on for years. Tony had prepared a presentation that laid out everything he'd discovered, but he was careful not to turn it into a lecture. He used stories instead of statistics, personal experiences instead of legal jargon. He talked about Mr. Washington, the 75-year-old veteran who'd been pulled over 6 times for the crime of driving while black in his own neighborhood. He talked about Jennifer Martinez, the single mother who'd been arrested for asking questions about why police were searching her son. The room was completely silent as Tony spoke. People leaned forward in their chairs, and he could see recognition in many faces. These weren't isolated incidents that only affected other people. These were things that could happen to anyone in this room, had probably already happened to people they knew and loved. The question, Tony continued, is what we're going to do about it. We can sit here and be angry, or we can channel that anger into something productive. We can demand change, and we can make sure our voices are heard by people who have the power to actually fix this problem. After Tony finished his presentation, he opened the floor for questions and comments. What happened next was something he hadn't expected. One by one, people began standing up to share their own stories. Not just about Officer Hoffman, but about the broader issues that had been festering in Millbrook for years. Mrs. Chun from the flower shop talked about how her family had been afraid to call police when their store was burglarized because they worried about how they'd be treated. A local businessman named Frank Murphy, who was white and owned a construction company, stood up to admit that he'd heard complaints about Officer Hoffman for years, but had assumed they were exaggerated. I was wrong, he said simply, and I should have spoken up sooner. The most powerful moment came when a teenager named Ashley stood up in the back of the room. She was maybe 16 years old, and her voice shook as she spoke. Last month, officer. Hoffman pulled me over when I was walking home from school. He said I looked like someone who'd been reported for shoplifting. He made me empty my backpack on the sidewalk in front of all my neighbors, even though I had my student ID and everything. I felt so humiliated that I didn't tell my parents for 2 weeks. The room erupted in angry murmurs, but Tony raised his hand for quiet. Ashley, thank you for sharing that. It took courage to stand up and tell your story. And that's exactly why we're here tonight. Because when we stay silent, officers like Hoffman think they can keep getting away with this behavior. As the meeting continued, something remarkable began to happen. People started talking about solutions instead of just problems. Dr. Williams, a local physician who'd attended the meeting with his wife, suggested organizing a letter-writing campaign to state and federal officials. Maria Santos, who worked for the county government, offered to help navigate the bureaucracy involved in filing formal complaints. Several veterans in the audience said they wanted to support Robert as fellow service members, even though they'd served in different branches and different wars. By the end of the evening, Tony had a list of over 50 volunteers who wanted to help with various aspects of what was becoming a community-wide effort to address police misconduct. But more importantly, he had something he hadn't expected when he'd first come home. He had hope that real change was possible after most of the crowd had left. Tony found himself surrounded by a smaller group of community leaders who wanted to talk about next steps. Catherine Rodriguez had driven up from the capital to attend the meeting, and she was impressed by what she'd witnessed. "This is how successful civil rights campaigns start," she told the group, "with ordinary people deciding they've had enough and they're willing to work together to demand better. But I want everyone to understand that this is going to be a long process. The legal system moves slowly and there will be setbacks along the way." Pastor Johnson from the MT, Olive Baptist Church, where Robert's family had attended services for 20 years, raised his hand. "What can we do to keep people motivated when things get difficult? Because they will get difficult." Tony had been thinking about this question himself. We stay focused on why we're doing this. It's not about revenge against Officer Hoffman, though he needs to face consequences for his actions. It's about making sure that what happened to my father never happens to anyone else's father. It's about creating a community where everyone feels safe and respected. Over the next week, Tony watched in amazement as the movement he'd helped start began to take on a life of its own. Volunteers organized themselves into committees focused on different aspects of the campaign. Some people worked on documentation, helping other victims prepare formal complaints. Others focused on media outreach, making sure the story stayed in the news. A group of local business owners formed a coalition to pressure the city council for police reform. The most surprising development came when Tony received a call from Detective Williams, a black police officer from the State Patrol who'd heard about the case through law enforcement channels. "Lieutenant Commander Williams," the detective said, "I want you to know that there are good cops out there who are just as disgusted by this behavior as you are. Some of us have been trying to address these problems from inside the system, but we need community pressure to make real change happen." Tony felt like they were finally building the kind of coalition that could create lasting change. But he also knew that the hardest part was still ahead of them. Officer Hoffman and his supporters weren't going to give up without a fight. And the police department had resources and legal protections that made them formidable opponents, still. As Tony looked around at all the people who'd stepped up to support his father and demand justice, he felt something he hadn't felt since this whole ordeal began. He felt like they were going to win. Agent Patricia Reynolds from the FBI Civil Rights Division arrived in Millbrook on a quiet Tuesday morning, driving an unmarked sedan and carrying a briefcase full of federal authority. She'd been investigating police misconduct cases for 12 years, but something about the Williams case had caught her attention. It wasn't just the clear evidence of excessive force. It was the systematic way the local police department had tried to cover it up, and the organized community response that had emerged in the weeks since Tony Williams met Agent Reynolds at a small diner outside of town, away from curious eyes and potential department informants. She was a tall woman in her 40s with graying hair and the kind of direct gaze that came from years of dealing with people who thought they were above the law. "I've reviewed all the materials you sent through your attorney," Agent Reynolds sighed, spreading several files across the diner table. "What you've documented here goes beyond individual misconduct. We're looking at potential violations of federal civil rights laws, conspiracy to deprive citizens of their constitutional rights, and possibly obstruction of justice." Tony felt his heart rate increase. This was what he'd been hoping for, but hearing it from a federal agent made it real in a way that scared and excited him at the same time. What does that mean for Officer Hoffman? If we can prove what I think we can prove, Officer Hoffman is looking at serious federal charges. But more importantly for your community, the entire police department could be subject to federal oversight. We have the authority to investigate not just individual officers, but entire departments that show patterns of civil rights violations. Agent Reynolds explained that the FBI had been tracking complaints about the Millbrook Police Department for several years. Tony's comprehensive documentation had provided the missing pieces they needed to build a federal case. But she also warned him that a federal investigation would take months, maybe years, to complete. "The good news," she continued, "is that once we open an official investigation, Officer Hoffman will be suspended without pay pending the outcome. The department won't be able to protect him anymore. Back in Millbrook, Tony's community organizing efforts were gaining momentum in ways that surprised everyone involved. What had started as a response to his father's assault had evolved into a broader movement for police accountability and community empowerment. The weekly meetings at the community center were drawing larger crowds, and people were starting to organize around issues beyond just Officer Hoffman. The breakthrough that changed everything came from an unexpected source, Betty Morrison, who worked as a clerk in the police department's administrative office, had been watching the community meetings on local cable access television. She was a 55-year-old grandmother who'd worked for the city for 23 years, and what she'd been seeing in the news didn't match what she knew from working inside the department. Betty called Tony on a Thursday evening, her voice shaking with nervousness. "Mr. Williams, I saw your father on the news, and I want you to know that what happened to him was wrong. But there's something else you need to know. Something about those complaint files that people say went missing." They arranged to meet at a parking lot behind the public library. Betty arrived carrying a manila envelope that she clutched like it contained gold. In many ways it did. "I made copies," she said simply, "before they disappeared from the files. I've been keeping them at home because something about the whole situation didn't feel right." Inside the envelope were photocopies of 17 formal complaints against Officer Hoffman dating back 6 years. Complaints that the department had claimed were never filed or had been lost due to administrative errors. Each one detailed incidents similar to what had happened to Robert Williams and the other victims Tony had interviewed, but that wasn't the most damaging evidence Betty had brought. At the bottom of the envelope were copies of emails between police Chief Davidson and several supervisors discussing how to handle the Hoffman situation and minimize department liability. Tony's hands trembled as he read through the emails. They revealed a deliberate strategy to discourage complaints, loose paperwork, and transfer Officer Hoffman to different beats when community pressure got too intense. One email from Chief Davidson was particularly damning. "We need to keep Hoffman's complaint file thin. If this pattern becomes official, we're looking at federal intervention." "Mrs. Morrison," Tony said, looking up from the documents, "do you understand what this means?" Betty nodded grimly. "It means they knew. They all knew what he was doing, and they helped him cover it up. That's why I brought this to you. My grandson is 17 years old, and he's a good kid, but he's also a black kid living in this town. What if he runs into Officer Hoffman someday? What if my grandson becomes another victim because I stayed quiet?" Tony immediately called Catherine Rodriguez and Agent Reynolds. The evidence Betty had provided transformed their case from strong to overwhelming. They now had documentation proving that the police department had systematically destroyed evidence and obstructed justice to protect an officer they knew was violating people's civil rights. Agent Reynolds arrived in Millbrook the next day with a team of federal investigators. They executed search warrants at the police department, seizing computers, files, and records. Officer Hoffman was arrested at his home on federal charges of violating citizens' civil rights under color of law. Chief Davidson and 2 supervisors were also arrested for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. The arrests sent shockwaves through Millbrook. For decades, the police department had operated like they were untouchable. Now, suddenly, federal agents were treating them like the criminals they'd been investigating. The local newspaper ran a front-page story with the headline, "Federal Agents Arrest Local Police Officials in Civil Rights Case." But the most satisfying moment for Tony came when he called his father with the news. Robert Williams was at home, doing physical therapy exercises for his wrist, when Tony told him about the arrests. "They really arrested him?" Robert asked, his voice full of disbelief. "Dad, not only did they arrest Hoffman, they arrested the people who were protecting him. This isn't just about what happened to you anymore. The FBI is investigating the entire department. They're going to make sure this never happens to anyone else." Robert was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was stronger than Tony had heard it since the assault. "Son, I'm proud of what you've done. Not just for our family, but for everyone in this community who was too scared to speak up. The community meeting that week was unlike any they'd held before. Instead of anger and frustration, the room was filled with hope and determination. Agent Reynolds attended to brief the community on the federal investigation and to encourage other victims to come forward with additional evidence. "What's happened here in Millbrook is remarkable," Agent Reynolds told the crowd. "In most cases, police misconduct continues because communities feel powerless to fight back. But you've shown that ordinary citizens, working together and using the legal system properly, can hold even powerful institutions accountable." Tony stood at the back of the room, watching his neighbors celebrate what felt like the first real victory they'd had in years. But he also knew this was just the beginning. Removing bad officers was important, but real change would require rebuilding trust between the police and the community, implementing new training and oversight procedures, and making sure that what happened to his father could never happen again. As people began filing out of the community center, many stopped to shake Tony's hand or thank him for his leadership. But the person whose opinion mattered most to him was his father, who walked up with tears in his eyes. "Tony," Robert said, putting his good arm around his son's shoulders, "you've turned the worst day of my life into something that's going to make life better for a lot of people. That takes a special kind of courage." Looking around at the diverse group of neighbors who'd come together to demand justice, Tony realized that his father was right. They'd found a way to transform pain into purpose and fear into strength. Officer Hoffman had thought he could intimidate one old man on a quiet street. Instead, he'd awakened an entire community. The federal courthouse in downtown Springfield had never seen anything quite like the crowd that gathered on the morning of Officer Derek Hoffman's sentencing. People had driven from all over the state to witness what many considered a historic moment. Robert Williams sat in the front row, his wrist finally healed but his determination stronger than ever. Next to him sat his son Tony, who had returned from his Navy deployment specifically for this day. 6 months had passed since Hoffman's arrest, and the legal proceedings had moved faster than anyone expected. The evidence was so overwhelming that Hoffman's lawyers had advised him to accept a plea deal rather than risk a trial that could have resulted in an even longer sentence. He had pleaded guilty to multiple federal civil rights violations, admitting that he had used his position as a police officer to intimidate and assault citizens based on their race. Judge Elizabeth Carter presided over the sentencing hearing with the gravity that such cases deserved. She was known throughout the federal district as a fair but tough judge who didn't tolerate abuse of power, especially by law enforcement officers. Before announcing Hoffman's sentence, she allowed several victims to address the court. Robert Williams was the first to speak. He walked slowly to the podium, his voice steady as he faced the man who had changed his life 6 months earlier. "Your Honor, what Officer Hoffman did to me wasn't just an assault on my body. It was an assault on my dignity, my sense of safety in my own community, and my faith in the justice system. For almost 40 years, I served this community as a postal worker. I knew every family, helped during emergencies, and considered Millbrook my home. Officer Hoffman made me feel like a stranger in my own neighborhood." Robert paused, looking directly at Hoffman, who sat at the defendant's table with his head down. "But I want the court to know that I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because what happened to me revealed a pattern of abuse that had been going on for years. Other families suffered in silence because they didn't have the resources or support to fight back. If my experience helps prevent other fathers, other sons, other community members from being victimized, then something good will have come from something terrible." Next to speak was Jerome Patterson, the young man whose porch arrest video had become crucial evidence in the federal case. "Your Honor, I'm 22 years old, and before this happened, I believed that if you followed the rules and respected authority, you'd be treated fairly. Officer Hoffman taught me that wasn't always true. He arrested me on my own property for the crime of existing while black in my own neighborhood. That arrest cost me a job opportunity because the charges stayed on my record for months before they were dropped." One by one, other victims told their stories. Mrs. Martinez spoke about how her son had been afraid to walk to school for weeks after his encounter with Hoffman, Mr. Washington. The elderly veteran described how the repeated traffic stops had made him afraid to drive to his doctor's appointments. Each testimony painted a picture of an officer who had systematically terrorized certain members of the community while his supervisors looked the other way. The most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Officer Patricia Hayes, a black police officer from a neighboring department, had requested permission to address the court. "Your Honor, I've been a police officer for 15 years, and I want the court to understand that what Derek Hoffman did doesn't represent the majority of law enforcement officers. Most of us became cops to serve and protect all members of our communities. But officers like Hoffman make our jobs harder and more dangerous. They destroy the trust that we need to do our jobs effectively, and they make every traffic stop, every community interaction more tense and difficult." Officer Hayes continued, "When police officers abuse their power, they don't just hurt their immediate victims. They hurt every honest cop who has to work twice as hard to rebuild community trust. They hurt public safety by making citizens afraid to call for help when they need it." What happened in Millbrook should serve as a warning to every police department in the country about the consequences of tolerating misconduct. When it came time for Hoffman's lawyers to speak, they offered a brief statement about their client's remorse and his difficult childhood, but Judge Carter had clearly heard enough. She had reviewed thousands of pages of evidence, read dozens of victim impact statements, and studied the broader pattern of abuse that the FBI investigation had uncovered. "Mr. Hoffman," Judge Carter said, looking directly at the defendant, "you took an oath to serve and protect the citizens of Millbrook. Instead, you used your badge and gun to intimidate, harass, and assault the very people you were sworn to protect. The evidence shows that your actions weren't isolated incidents or momentary lapses in judgment. They were part of a deliberate pattern of targeting minority citizens for abuse." She continued, "What makes your crimes even more serious is that they were committed under color of law. Citizens have a right to expect that police officers will treat them with dignity and respect, regardless of their race or economic status. When officers violate that trust, they undermine the very foundation of law and order in our society." Judge Carter sentenced Hoffman to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. The sentence was longer than many had expected, and gasps could be heard throughout the courtroom, but the judge wasn't finished. "Mr. Hoffman, I also want you to understand that your actions have had consequences beyond your own criminal liability. The FBI's investigation revealed that your supervisors knew about your pattern of misconduct and actively worked to cover it up. Chief Davidson has been sentenced to 4 years in prison for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. 2 other supervisors received sentences of 2 years each. An entire police department has been placed under federal oversight because of the culture of corruption that allowed your behavior to continue unchecked." After the sentencing, the crowd gathered outside the courthouse for what had become an impromptu celebration. Tony Williams found himself surrounded by reporters asking for his reaction to the sentence. He had prepared a brief statement, but when he looked out at the diverse group of people who had supported his family through this ordeal, he decided to speak from the heart instead. 8 years ago, if someone had told me that my military training would be most useful in fighting injustice in my own hometown, I wouldn't have believed them," Tony said. But that's exactly what happened. My father was assaulted by someone who was supposed to protect him, and our community came together to demand justice. Today's sentence shows that no one is above the law, not even those who wear a badge. Tony paused, looking for his father in the crowd. Robert was talking to Mrs. Chun from the flower shop, both of them smiling for the first time in months. But this case was never really about Derek Hoffman. It was about whether ordinary citizens have the power to hold their government accountable. When it fails them, today we prove that they do. Catherine Rodriguez, the civil rights attorney who had worked tirelessly on the case, stepped up to the microphone next. The Williams family could have accepted a settlement and moved on with their lives. Instead, They chose to fight for systemic change that would protect other families from experiencing what they went through. That kind of courage is rare, and it's exactly what our justice system needs more of. As the crowd began to disperse, Tony walked over to his father, who was standing quietly near the courthouse steps. "How do you feel, Dad?" Robert thought for a moment before answering. "I feel like justice was served today. But more than that, I feel like we've shown people that they don't have to accept injustice silently. Sometimes you have to stand up and fight back, even when it's scary and difficult." Tony nodded, thinking about the long journey from that morning on Main Street to this moment on the courthouse steps. "Dad, you know what the best part of all this is?" "What's that, son?" "Officer." Hoffman thought he could intimidate one old man and get away with it. Instead, he woke up an entire community and ended up destroying his own career and the corrupt system that protected him. Sometimes the people who think they have all the power are the most vulnerable when ordinary citizens decide they've had enough. As father and son walked away from the courthouse together, both knew that this chapter of their story was ending. But the movement they had helped start was just beginning. 1 year after Officer Hoffman's sentencing, Robert Williams walked the same route through downtown Millbrook that had changed his life forever, but this morning felt completely different. The streets looked the same shops lined Main Street, and the same neighbors waved from their windows. What had changed was everything else. The new police chief, Commander Janet Foster, had been brought in from outside the department specifically to reform the culture and rebuild community trust. She was a 25-year veteran of law enforcement, who had spent the last decade specializing in community policing and police reform. One of her first acts as chief was to walk the same route Robert took every morning, introducing herself to business owners and residents along the way. "Mr. Williams," Chief Foster had said during their first meeting, "I want you to know that what happened to you will never happen again on my watch. But more than that, I want to earn back the trust that this department lost. That's going to take time, and it's going to require transparency and accountability that hasn't existed here before." The changes in the Millbrook Police Department were dramatic and comprehensive. Every officer now wore body cameras that couldn't be turned off during interactions with the public. A new civilian oversight board with members elected by the community reviewed all complaints against police officers. Monthly community meetings were held where residents could ask questions and voice concerns directly to department leadership. But perhaps the most significant change was the implementation of something called the Williams Protocol, a set of procedures named in honor of Robert that required multiple levels of review before any use of force incident could be closed. Every arrest, every traffic stop, every interaction between police and citizens was now documented and reviewed by supervisors who were held accountable for the actions of officers under their command. Tony Williams had returned to active duty with the Navy, but his work in Millbrook had caught the attention of his superiors in ways he never expected. The Pentagon had asked him to consult on a new program that helped military veterans transition their leadership skills into civilian community organizing. Tony found himself traveling to other cities where police misconduct had become a problem, sharing the lessons he'd learned in his hometown. "And the military taught me how to plan operations and achieve objectives," Tony would tell audiences at conferences and community meetings. "But Millbrook taught me that the most important battles are often fought in courtrooms and community centers, not on foreign battlefields. Real change happens when ordinary people decide they're not going to accept injustice anymore." The Williams Foundation for Police Accountability, which Tony had established with his father's blessing, had grown from a small local organization into a national resource for communities dealing with police misconduct. The foundation provided legal support, helped train community organizers, and maintained a database of successful police reform strategies that other cities could adapt to their own situations. Robert Williams had become something he never expected. To be at the age of 69, a community activist and public speaker. He spoke at universities, testified before state legislatures, and traveled to other cities where families were dealing with police violence. But his message was always the same: Ordinary citizens have more power than they realize, and justice is possible when people work together. I never wanted to become a civil rights leader, Robert would tell audiences. I just wanted to take my morning walk without being bothered. But sometimes life pushes you into roles you never expected. When that happens, you have a choice. You can stay silent and hope the problem goes away, or you can stand up and fight for what's right. The changes in Millbrook extended far beyond just the police department. The community organizing skills that people had learned during the fight for police accountability were now being applied to other issues. A new affordable housing initiative had been launched after residents used the same tactics that had worked against police misconduct. The school board had implemented new policies for addressing racial disparities in discipline after parents organized using methods they'd learned during the Williams campaign. Mrs. Chung from the flower shop had been elected to the city council, running on a platform of transparency and community engagement. Jerome Patterson, the young man whose porch arrest video had helped break the case open, was now studying criminal justice in college with plans to become a civil rights lawyer. Betty Morrison, the police department clerk who had risked her job to provide crucial evidence, had been promoted to head of civilian oversight for the department. The ripple effects of the Williams case reached far beyond Millbrook, the state legislature had passed the Millbrook Police Reform Act, which required all police departments in the state to implement similar accountability measures. The FBI had used the Williams case as a model for investigating police departments in other cities, leading to federal interventions in departments with similar patterns of misconduct. Tony received regular updates about these developments during his deployments, and each one reinforced his belief that they had chosen the right path. Rather than seeking personal revenge against Officer Hoffman, they had focused on systemic change that protected other families from experiencing what his had gone through. The most satisfying moment for Tony came during a video call with his father while he was deployed overseas. Robert was sitting in the Millbrook Community Center, where a meeting was being held to discuss the first anniversary of the police reforms. The room was packed with people, just like it had been a year earlier, but the mood was completely different. "Son, you should see this place," Robert said, turning his laptop so Tony could see the crowd. A year ago, people came to these meetings because they were angry and scared. Tonight, they're here because they're proud of what we've accomplished together, and they want to keep building on it. Tony could see familiar faces in the crowd. There was Catherine Rodriguez, the civil rights attorney who had become a close family friend. There was Chief Foster, who attended every community meeting to answer questions and provide updates on department reforms. There were dozens of neighbors and community members who had discovered their own power to create change. "Dad," Tony said, "do you ever think about what would have happened if you had just accepted what Officer Hoffman did and tried to move on?" Robert was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "I think about it sometimes. Life would certainly have been easier. But then I think about Ashley, that 16-year-old girl who got humiliated when Hoffman made her empty her backpack on the sidewalk. I think about Jerome getting arrested on his own porch. I think about all the people who suffered in silence before we decided to speak up." He paused, looking around the room full of engaged, empowered citizens. "If we had stayed quiet, Officer Hoffman would still be out there hurting people. The corrupt supervisors would still be covering up misconduct. And this community would still be living in fear instead of working together to solve problems." As the community meeting continued, Robert reflected on how much his life had changed since that morning when he'd simply wanted to take his daily walk. He'd gone from being a retired postal worker living quietly in his neighborhood to being a nationally recognized advocate for police, accountability, and community empowerment. But the change he was most proud of wasn't in himself. It was in his community. Millbrook had transformed from a place where people felt powerless to challenge authority into a model for other cities struggling with similar problems. The same neighbors who had once been afraid to speak up were now running for office, organizing campaigns, and taking active roles in shaping their community's future. Tony's leave time was coming to an end, and he would soon return to his ship and his military duties. But he knew that the work he and his father had started would continue without him. They had built something bigger than any individual case or personal grievance. They had created a template for how ordinary citizens could hold powerful institutions accountable when those institutions failed to serve the public interest. As Tony prepared to hang up the video call, his father had one final thought to share. "You know what I realized tonight, son? Officer Hoffman thought he was showing me my place when he knocked me down on that sidewalk, but what he actually did was show me my power. He showed all of us our power, and now that we know what we're capable of when we work together, there's no going back." Looking at his father's face on the screen, surrounded by neighbors and friends who had become fellow activists and community leaders, Tony realized that this was what victory looked like. Not just justice for one family, but transformation for an entire community. Not just punishment for wrongdoers, but prevention of future wrongs. Not just healing from trauma, but growth into something stronger and more resilient than before. Officer Hoffman had tried to intimidate one man on a quiet street. Instead, he had awakened a community and created a movement that would protect countless others for years to come.